Hi, and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast. Episode 134 is an interview with Patrick Wilson, author of the book, The Athlete's Gut. Patrick is also an assistant professor of exercise science and a registered dietitian. The Athlete's Gut combines the latest research on exercise and the gut with humorous descriptions and relatable real-life anecdotes. After reading his books, athletes will better understand the inner workings of their own gut and will be equipped to implement strategies to perform and feel better. Now, I recently read this fantastic book and knew I wanted you to hear all about it. So I contacted Patrick and he was more than happy to come on the podcast and share his knowledge on all things the Athlete's Gut. I know you will learn a lot from this interview, but I do really recommend buying the book too. The links are in the show notes to the podcast. If you find this podcast informative and helpful, why don't you make sure other athletes like you can find out about it by subscribing and leaving a comment or a review. Are you sick and tired of being injured or running in pain with those annoying niggles? Ensure you are ready for racing in 2022 and come in and see the team at Health and High Performance. Learn to love running again by heading to healthhp.com.au/run, or you can easily find them on Instagram, Health and High Performance. Did you know that your mindset is actually the gateway to unlocking your fullest athletic and performance potential? You know, you followed the training program to the letter, you're feeling the fittest, fastest and healthiest you've ever felt, and yet you're so strung out by nerves and negative self-talk that you fall apart on race day and don't fulfill your potential. Sound familiar? If so, one-on-one mindset coaching may be for you. I work with you, one-on-one obviously, to develop your emotions and mindset to support your goals. This one-on-one coaching is conducted over Zoom and recorded, so you get to keep it. And it is designed to specifically suit your needs of developing a peak performance mindset and approach to running. I only work with a limited number of people at a time as it is a highly personalised service. So I recommend quickly getting onto my website, peakendurancecoaching.com.au, and filling out the form that's there to get yourself on the waiting list. I really hope you enjoy this interview with Patrick Wilson and that you learn a lot about the Athlete's Gut. Hi, Patrick, and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast.
Hey, Isabel, thanks for inviting me on. It's good to be here.
No worries. Now, before we get into the full interview, can you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and any athletic background that you have?
Sure. I mean, I've been always kind of a run-of-the-mill, slightly above average athlete. I've grew up doing distance running, cross-country, track, basketball, kind of a multi-sport athlete. Was usually always better than the average, but never elite at anything sort of situation. And that, kind of was the basis for my interest ultimately in kind of pursuing exercise science and physiology and nutrition as my, career path, as I ultimately, went on to do a master's and PhD in exercise physiology. Before that, I had done an undergraduate degree in dietetics, and I got my registered dietitian credential. So yeah, I've been an athlete my whole life. I still run today. I kind of stick to shorter distances. My body isn't really, I think, built to handle the ultra distances. So I try and stick with shorter stuff that's faster for me, not actually at any elite level. But I've kind of been active my whole life and involved in sport in some way or another.
Yeah, sounds good. And obviously you've done a lot of study and that's taken up a lot of time too.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of my research agendas kind of are a little bit all over the place. That's good or bad, depending on who you ask. But certainly part of it has been, nutrition focused on, gut function and performance. And then also kind of more recently, I've been doing some work on the psychological aspects of GI issues or GI function in sport and athletes. So that's kind of been a newer area for me that has been pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, I recently read your book, The Athlete's Gut. it's hard to see when I've got a background, but I will put a picture of that in the show notes. And it was recommended to me by one of my coaching clients. Now, I've read lots of nutrition books and that sort of thing, and they often have a little bit about stomach distress or digestion for an athlete, but this whole book is about that. What made you decide to write a whole book on this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd started off thinking about writing a book on something kind of related to sport nutrition, because that's, kind of my wheelhouse in terms of my expertise. Yeah. And I realized pretty quickly, I mean, there's many, many sports nutrition books. So putting out another one, just kind of thinking about what would be the uniqueness or novelty of that. And it was kind of hard to think of a way, I think, to do that and make it, sort of fresh or new. And, a good chunk of my research has been on, at least either directly or somewhat indirectly, the function of the gut as it relates to nutrition and exercise. So I kind of started considering the idea of writing essentially a book on it, because especially for endurance athletes, it's a pretty major factor in terms of whether or not they're going to perform well or train well, is whether or not their gut is functioning appropriately. And, it's kind of a little bit of an afterthought sometimes until, an athlete has like a major issue, and then obviously comes to the forefront of their mind pretty obviously and quickly. And I think pretty much every endurance athlete and many team sport athletes at some point or another have had, one of those experiences where they had to, run to the porta-john or dive into the bushes, or, there's been a high profile athletes who have had that happen, on television. So we all have kind of either seen it or experienced ourselves. So I started writing, and then found that, I could actually probably get a whole book of material out of the topic in one way or another. So started kind of as a goal to do sport nutrition, something, and then expanded from there to just focus more specifically on the gut.
Yeah. And I have to say, it's a topic that you would think would be, a hard read, but the way you wrote it was really quite amusing. You've got a great sense of humor, and the funny little bits in it made it really good. So I have to say I enjoyed that.
Well, I got to convince my wife that I have a sense of humor first. But I tried to make it engaging, because I know most of the people reading it would be athletes or practitioners, and the publisher that I worked with also did a good job of kind of pushing me to do more of that, and then also giving feedback. So I was pretty appreciative of, their reviewing and help on that.
Yeah. So for those listeners who are thinking about reading it, it's entertaining as well as informative. So most of the people who listen to this podcast are runners. Now, runners are notorious for stomach issues. Can you tell us why they seem to experience so much?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a unique combination of, the demands of the sport. Obviously, I mean, there's kind of the sheer running's a vigorous type of activity. I mean, certainly you can jog or slog and go slow, but, for any athlete who's kind of pushing the envelope or trying to get PRs or improve their times, I mean, it's a vigorous intensity. And anytime you have really vigorous exercise, there's a competition going on in your body in terms of where's the blood going to go, where's the oxygen going to go and the nutrients. And during heavy exercise, the big priority is going to be the skeletal muscle. And then particularly in the heat, the other priority is going to be the skin to help cool you off for sweating purposes. And then also just get that warm blood to the surface of your body so that heat can be dissipated. So that's a big part of it, is just the intensity of running itself. But then there's this other idea that it's also, just the jarring nature of, footfall after footfall impacting the ground. There's at least a theory or a hypothesis that causes kind of micro damage to the gut, especially if you're doing that repetitively over, an hour, 2 to 3 hours. The combination of this intense aerobic activity with the jarring nature of it maybe explains partly why certain symptoms are more prevalent in runners than you might experience in other types of activities. But you might experience other symptoms more frequently, for example, in cycling, like, the kind of hunched over position. You might have more regurgitation, reflux issues, whereas with running, it might be more the lower abdominal stuff, cramping, or just to have to use the restroom. It's also dependent kind of on the situation, the length of the race, the environmental conditions. But yeah, I mean, I think for runners, it's the mixture of the intensity of the sport, along with, that kind of jarring nature of just repetitively hitting the ground over and over again, thousands of times over the course of a race.
And so if it's a really warm day when the race happens to be, what should we take as our main consideration to help us with digestion then?
Yeah, I think number one, trying to be as acclimatized to that warm environment as you possibly can is the first consideration. And I mean, that seems obvious, but sometimes, especially like when you're coming around to the early part of summer or late spring, and maybe you haven't had an opportunity to do any heat training, and then it's a warm day, more than usual on competition day or something like that, or even during a long training run, and you're just not accustomed to that, and maybe you have to reduce the amount of solid food or fuel that you actually consume, because that you're not going to be able to tolerate it, in part because of the heat. So number one is, making sure you are acclimatizing to the environment that you expect to compete in. If you think you're going to be competing in a hot environment, then working those heat training sessions into your program somehow or another. I mean, obviously that's pretty easy in the summer, but certain times of year, it's a larger challenge. I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, so it's hot in the summer, but for 6 or 7 months out of the year, it's, below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and then into the negative digits for a good chunk of the year. So a little bit more challenging to do it in that situation. Beyond that, though, I mean, I would say obviously hydration is going to make a difference, because if you're sweating profusely, losing a lot of fluid, that can ultimately compromise your blood volume and your body's ability to kind of share those resources. And it does happen, in a situation where someone tends to lose a fair amount of sweat and isn't replacing it, or they start off a training session or competition suboptimally hydrated. Maybe they have been training a lot and they just haven't been drinking enough, and they're starting off their competition or training session a little bit less hydrated than they should be. But hydration is a tricky one for sure, because it's kind of this tightrope of, you have to do enough to kind of try and stave off excessive dehydration. But if you push it too much, I mean, just drinking too much fluid can cause gut distress. So yeah, it's one where it's a tricky balance. And I try and convey that message in the book, and that there's not really like just a simple, this is the amount that you are supposed to drink over this amount of time. It depends on the situation, and especially the environmental conditions. But yeah, a big take home point is to kind of practice what you think you're going to do in terms of hydration on a competition day, and then ensuring that you're well hydrated starting off, so that you're not already kind of behind as you get going. It's hard to make that up moving forward in certain races, especially of high intensity, if you're already starting off somewhat dehydrated.
Does the cold provide different challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, you tend to have a lower, sweat rate. Although, in cold conditions or cooler conditions, athletes can sometimes work harder, and it almost like, it's maybe not as big of a difference as you would sometimes expect in terms of their sweat rate. So sometimes it can be surprisingly high. If they're really a top end athlete and they're working hard, you can still have some pretty substantial losses of sweat. And they may think that they have to drink less in a cold environment because they just think, well, it's cold or it's cool, I don't need to worry about it. And in some cases, they can end up dehydrated because they're just not really thinking about it, and it's not present in their mind because of the environmental conditions. So I think it is a good thing to do is just, go out for some of your longer training runs, occasionally measure your weight before and afterwards. Also consider how much fluid you've consumed during, because that's obviously going to impact how much weight you lost. But most of the weight that you lose over a couple of hours of exercise is due to fluid loss. There's not a whole lot else, unless you stop to use the restroom or something like that. So your weight loss can be used as kind of a gauge in terms of your sweat rates, and just knowing approximately how much you're sweating in different environments at least gives you a starting point to say, how much you might need to consume in these different environments, because it is going to vary depending on the environment. And it's also going to depend on your pace. So keeping, kind of a track of some of these things, you don't have to do it at every run, but doing it periodically in different environments at different paces gives you a sense of how much you're going to lose and how much you might want to target in terms of replacement.
That's really good advice. And we spend so much time training that, it seems crazy not to do that, because that's often the case for why we've had to DNF, is because of gut issues.
Yeah.
And to not focus on it during training, it seems a bit of a mistake.
Yeah. I think it's particularly challenging in ultra races because most of the research on hydration and what's the most effective strategy? Do you use thirst, or do you use some sort of structured plan? Most of the research on that is, up to a couple of hours or a few hours, and there's not much that goes out beyond that for just logistical reasons. It's hard to do those experiments. So honestly, it's a little bit of an unknown, like what is the best hydration strategy for ultra competition. And it's kind of an educated guess at this point. We don't have, just super clear evidence that this approach is better than another approach. And I think anybody telling you otherwise is probably misrepresenting what the research is actually saying, what's actually available to us in terms of hydration research. So it's a little bit of a educated guess, and then using your own experience from training to figure out what works best for you.
Yeah. Are there any types of foods that are particularly worse for causing stomach distress?
Yeah, during exercise, there's some things that are consistent. For some foods, it's just a person-to-person thing, but on average, if you look at a group of people in the study, things like very hypertonic beverages, those would be highly concentrated beverages, like a juice or a soda or a beverage you've made at home on your own, in the carbohydrate concentrations, maybe above 10%. Now, if you're just sipping on that, it's probably not a big deal, but if you're gulping that down, then that's where it becomes more of a problem. So I don't want to give people the impression that if you're taking sips of a hypertonic beverage, it's going to be a major issue, because it may really not be. It's kind of the totality of what you're putting in over the course of a race, and how frequently and how much at any given time is also going to matter. But the reason why a hypertonic beverage might cause more issues if you consume it in large amounts is, carbohydrate concentration, energy density is the main factor that tells your stomach how quickly to empty stuff. So if it's really concentrated with energy and carbohydrate, there'll be a signal from your small intestine where there's kind of sensory tissue that'll tell your stomach, hey, let's kind of slow things down because this is a really big load of carb. We don't want it all dumping into the small intestine at once. So one way you could at least, try and be better with not having those symptoms from a hypertonic beverage is if you just train with it and get used to it, the body will adapt to some degree. So that's a big point, I think, especially for ultra runners, is, incorporating this stuff into your training. If you think you're going to use a hypertonic beverage and try and use that as a part of your fueling strategy, then you just need to incorporate that into your training and see how it goes and expose your gut to it so that it has time to kind of adapt and get used to it. Another interesting one is solid foods. I know for ultra runners, it's more common to rely on that for a variety of reasons, portability, taste fatigue, all sorts of reasons. It's interesting in that some studies suggest that solid bars and things like that might cause more bloating and fullness in those types of issues, maybe nausea, than like a beverage or a carbohydrate gel. The reason potentially being the size of a food particle plays a role in how quickly it empties the gut. So a gel and a beverage is already kind of like broken down.
Yeah.
A bar, it's like larger particles. And if you don't chew that bar well, your stomach's going to kind of sense that, your small intestine will sense that, and it'll slow the emptying of that bar potentially. So if you are going to use solid food, my one thing would just be, make sure you chew it pretty well in terms of maybe minimizing some of the risk of feeling more bloated or full or nauseated. If you're just kind of scarfing a bar down or solid food down without really chewing it, and you're doing that repeatedly, that might be one of the things that could, lead to more nausea, bloating, fullness, that sort of thing. Beyond that, it's, lots of fat can do it. Lots of fiber. It is person to person. It's dependent on the exercise intensity, but those are some of the things that, people might want to pay attention to in terms of the most common triggers.
And I mean, once again, it comes down to practicing it in training and testing out different foods and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And there's hundreds of products out there. So it's hard to, a lot of times I get a question like, what do you think of this gel, or what do you think of this beverage? And I can make some sort of comment on it based on the ingredients, but people respond pretty differently to different products based on, the formulation, the tastes, stuff that's hard to kind of really understand why they might not be responding to a particular product well. So yeah, even trying just the specific brands that you think are going to use, is a good idea, because you don't really want to be experimenting too much on race day.
No.
Yeah.
And I mean, and that's especially pertinent for people who might have intolerances or allergies, is to practice with foods. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly allergies and tolerances. I think one of the more interesting nutritional kind of intolerances that's been talked about in, gut issues with athletes has been the concept of FODMAPs, which are these like short chain carbohydrates that get fermented in the gut to a higher degree in some people. Some people seem to be more responsive to getting gut symptoms with eating FODMAPs. So that's one where there's kind of some growing evidence and interest in using that as a strategy, a low FODMAP diet, maybe a couple of days before an event, to reduce some of the symptoms that someone might otherwise experience if they're on a high FODMAP diet to begin with. Not everybody's eating a lot of FODMAPs. So like fructose, lactose are two really common ones, sugars that are considered FODMAPs that athletes tend to have higher intakes of. But then there's others that, are a little bit less well recognized. And it's hard to generalize like what foods are high in FODMAPs, because they're actually in grains, fruits, vegetables, and you have to actually look at a list of foods to say, okay, these are the ones that I maybe should avoid or at least reduce the intake of.
So why is it that sometimes like you'll have a nutrition plan and it works really well in a race and you think that's great, I'm going to do this next race, and it's terrible?
I wish I had a good answer to that question. It's, I
really
do.
All runners want the answer.
I know. If someone had an answer to that question, I mean, they would be, they would have, the winning strategy, obviously.
They would.
I think the nature of the gut is it's very variable. Symptoms can come and go. The biggest predictor of are you going to have issues is if you've had them in the past. So there does seem to be kind of a trend of people who tend to have these issues continue to have these issues, at least for, a period of time. They might ultimately get a handle on them, but that's the most consistent thing in studies. If you kind of go to a race, assess what people are experiencing in terms of their gut symptoms, if you ask about what they've experienced the last 3 months in training, that's the best predictor of whether or not they're going to have problems on race day. But beyond that, I think the other issue is that there's just so many different symptoms you can kind of experience. You can have nausea, you can have fullness, you can have bloating, cramping, side stitching, urges to use the restroom. And they're all kind of different things, and different stimuli and things can trigger these symptoms differently. So maybe one race you are struggling with nausea, and then another race you're struggling with, urges to have to use the restroom, and they're caused by two different things. So it is honestly pretty challenging sometimes to, with 100% certainty, come up with a plan that's going to completely eliminate, the GI issues. And I think that's particularly true of ultra running. It's just the rates of GI distress are so high that I think it's probably unreasonable to think that you would completely be able to prevent any issue.
And so what should we do then if we're halfway through a race and we encounter stomach distress? What should be our tactic to try to help alleviate it?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, I think it comes down to what is the source or what's the type of symptom or type of issue you're experiencing. If it's something like nausea, that's a challenge because, if it's because of underfeeling or because of underhydrating, at that point, if you're throwing up or you're nauseated, it's tough to kind of come back from that. So, I mean, it tends to be, you got to slow your pace. Maybe you need to rehydrate or get in fuel and really slow down until you start to feel better. there are supplements and medications that are used. I mean, ginger is one that anecdotally has evidence, and then does have evidence in other situations like motion sickness or pregnancy or chemotherapy. It is a decently effective anti-nausea supplement, but it hasn't been tested in the context of like an ultra race. So that's kind of just an educated guess and an experiment.
I personally find it works really, really well.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I mean, that's something, it's relatively low risk. So that's why I would say, I mean, you could try it. If you anticipate you might end up experiencing nausea, you could take it more kind of preventatively before a race or something like that, and maybe it would have some sort of effect. Ondansetron, Zofran is like the common medication that is kind of kept on hand at emergency tents and things like that by the medical directors of ultra races. So not good direct evidence that it is helpful, but I mean, it's, those are some of the more medication supplement type route things you can do, at least specifically to nausea. I mean, that's the challenge, I think, is once these symptoms start to appear, a lot of times you got to slow down. You got to kind of think back what you've done for your fueling, your hydration, and think, have you underdone it?
Yeah.
Or have you potentially overdone it? And both can be possibilities. I mean, both of those things can cause same symptoms, or similar symptoms. So depending on what you think it is, have you underfueled, have you overfueled, you'd have to adjust your strategy accordingly. I mean, maybe you do cut down on your carbohydrate intake because really you've just been pushing it too much. You wanted to be aggressive, you wanted to try and PR or something like that, but you've just been taking on too much, and your body's kind of at this point saying, it's no more. So you might have to kind of taper your intake just to adjust for that. So yeah, it's hard to give like this is what you should do, because it's going to be dependent on the situation in terms of, what's preceded those symptoms up to that point.
I was once in an ultra race, and, at an aid station, they had chips, and I had a big handful of chips, and that caused for me the salt. Is that a common thing for like salt to cause those sorts of issues?
Did it cause more issues for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one that's maybe underappreciated, that sometimes, especially in ultra races, taking electrolytes with the idea that it might be helpful for cramping or nausea or things like that. For the most part, there's not good evidence that says it's highly effective for preventing those things. And there are some studies, especially where you give really high amounts of electrolytes, where there is a fraction of people who have a really bad response to that in terms of they get nausea, they might vomit. You can kind of think, I mean, it's like drinking a hypertonic beverage. I mean, yes. Sodium and electrolytes do contribute to, what we call the osmolality of a solution. It's like drinking salt water in a way. I mean, if you drink way too much, or excuse me, if you consume too much electrolytes, it can certainly trigger nausea, cramping, those sorts of issues. It is understudied, to be honest, in terms of like, what's the amount that would tend to do that for people. We have a much better handle on like the carbohydrate amount that would tend to do that. But for sodium and other electrolytes, we don't have quite a good of a real handle on what's the threshold which you really would be more likely to start to experience those issues. But yeah, I would say it is a potential cause.
Yeah. No, we're often, as ultra runners, we're often doing races where we're out for, 20, 30 or more hours. How do we train for that length of race, like train the food, especially when we start to get, sick of certain foods, how do we train for that?
I think, you obviously you're not going to probably be doing 24-hour runs for training very commonly. So,
hope not.
So maybe going out and mixing, for one long training run, you're using this particular fuel. For another one, you're going with something completely different so that you kind of know, potentially what it's going to be like, or at least you're accustomed to fueling with that food, even if it's not like your, preferred fueling choice, after an hour or two of exercise, maybe just using something different that you might anticipate you would use later on in a race just to get accustomed to it. And then I think there are some, things in terms of maybe kind of more nibbling on things or sipping on things, as opposed to, just throwing things down the pipe every 20 minutes, if possible. I mean, that can be challenging too. to be kind of constantly eating. But later in a race, that might be helpful for reducing some of those symptoms you might experience, like nausea, fullness and bloating. And that can be, potentially helpful. Chewing your food really well. It seems like kind of a stupid thing, but
no, it's fair.
It's something that sometimes I think it's not at the forefront of an athlete's mind. And especially if, again, it's like a solid food that is otherwise maybe hard for your stomach to, or it takes more time for your stomach to break down. Do some of that extra work for your stomach. Your stomach already has enough problems to deal with in terms of it doesn't have as much blood flow as it probably wants. It's not functioning at its normal level. So trying to make it as easy as possible for your stomach to handle what you're going to be putting into it late in a race. But it's a challenge. Obviously, you're out there for, in some cases, 24 hours, multiple days for some races. And it's, how do you train for that? It's really challenging. And I think part of the reason, ultra runners get more successful over time is that they just get more experience with that stuff. Yes. And it's not like a marathon or a half marathon where you can train for this stuff in your training. For a lot of ultra stuff, it's, the races are the training in a way for future races. Yes. So just also realizing as you get more experience, you'll hopefully get better at some of this stuff.
What about, say, for instance, multi-day races where, you might be doing shorter distances, but you've got to back it up day after day after day. What should we be focusing on with nutrition for that?
I think it's easier to do a wider array of foods that are palatable for you, and things that come into mind would be more, what's portable, what's palatable, what's going to actually give you fuel, though. You don't want to necessarily be, a normal diet, you're focusing on things in terms of its healthful properties, outside of competition. But when it comes to a multi-day type race situation, it comes down to the logistical things in terms of what you can carry with you can bring with you, and what is going to be, palatable after 2 or 3 days. So that's one where I think those considerations tend to override others. And, GI issues in multi-day events don't tend to be quite as common as like a single stage race where it's, 12 to 24 hours, because you do tend to have some of those rest periods built in. And, the intensity isn't quite as high in terms of sustained intensity. So, I would say that you don't necessarily have to worry as much about those things. But if you do tend to have problems with GI distress in those multi-day events, at that point, you got to kind of trying to think about, is it actually due to the food that I'm eating, or is there something else going on that is, contributing? Is it I'm under drinking, right, for example, or is there some other source of the issue that, I haven't really identified yet? You can always, if you feel like you're having problems with the food you're eating, you could certainly reduce foods with lots of fiber or foods with, lots of fat or something like that. But some people do better on those foods in multi-day events. So, that's another one where, again, it's kind of experience-based, and it's hard to give, evidence-based recommendations because there just aren't any controlled studies. Feeding people or giving them different nutritional interventions or supplements in those types of events. It's all just kind of observational and anecdotal for the most part. Ultra running is really tough to do good research, and it makes it, I think, kind of an interesting sport that it's a lot of experimentation and individual experience that informs what people end up doing.
Yeah. Is there a place for fat or protein foods when doing such long events?
Yeah, I think definitely, especially multi-day events. You got to remember, you're putting your body under tremendous stress over 2 or 3 days in some cases. And, your body, your muscles are experiencing damage, and you're going to want a good amount of protein. Yeah. Fat is one that's interesting in that in a single stage race, on a given day, if you ingest fat right before or during an event, there's really not enough time for probably most of that fat to be digested and assimilated in the way that the body handles dietary fat to be used as a significant source of fuel. Whereas like carbohydrate, when you ingest it, it's more quickly used as a source of fuel post-ingestion. Yeah. So I would say in terms of multi-day racing, You certainly want a significant amount of protein, enough to, hopefully minimize some of the, the damaging processes that go on, and help you be able to kind of recover for those few days and be able to perform. In terms of dietary fat, that's kind of more probably a personal decision and preference, whether you feel like those foods are more palatable for you, or if you can tolerate them, fine. I mean, I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with relying on more dietary fat for multi-day events, especially. There's some interesting case studies that have done like multi-day events or really, really prolonged stuff, and they almost, I don't want to say exclusively relied on fat, but it was heavy in their intake, and some athletes do very well with that. So it really becomes kind of a personal preference thing, I think, when you're looking at multi-day events. But don't neglect protein.
Yeah, and it's certainly, fat is definitely a concentrated source of calories, I guess, as well.
Yeah. So like if you're, obviously you're carrying your own food or you're bringing your own food, that can be a very convenient way of getting in some of the calories that you need. Yeah. So that's definitely a good point.
Did you learn anything that surprised you whilst you were writing this book?
Yeah, good question. I'm trying to think. It's been a couple of years since I mean, the whole process of you write, and then it goes through edits, and then the publishing thing, and then so I'm trying to think if there was anything really that surprised me. I mean, there's definitely stuff along the way that you learn, and I think one of the more interesting parts of writing the book was just kind of trying to find anecdotes and stories of athletes who had these types of experiences on their own, and just incorporating that sort of stuff into the book, and realizing just how many high-level athletes have dealt with, with these issues. I mean, there's, really high-profile examples that, make the rounds on the internet or we see on YouTube or something like that. But there's lots of athletes who struggle with it. So I think I was maybe a little bit surprised in terms of just the sheer number, and even some of the most elite athletes you can think of that you don't think are going to be maybe jittery or nervous before games or competitions, but they struggle with it similarly or more in some cases than, your sub-elite athlete. So that was also, I think, kind of a little bit surprising.
So how does anxiety affect, like pre-race nerves? How does that affect our tummy when we're trying to race?
Yeah. There's definitely a deep connection between the brain and the gut. It's interesting in that the gut kind of functions to some extent on its own. It has its own nervous system embedded in it, so that like if you severed the connection from the spinal cord and the brain, you could still have actual movement of stuff through the gut, because there's almost reflexive in a way. Like if you're pushing food through the gut, some of that is just automatic. But the connection to the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, I mean, that kind of dials things up or down depending on what you're experiencing in your life at any given moment. So stress and anxiety can be one of those things that kind of dials up or down activity in the gut. And that can be, good or bad, depending on the situation. So when we tend to be stressed or anxious, we tend to see things in the upper half of the gut, like the stomach, the esophagus, motility, or kind of the propulsion of food and things through that part of the gut tends to slow down, kind of get backed up. And then in the lower half of the gut, particularly like the colon, the large intestine, stress and anxiety can have the opposite effect of kind of speeding things up or increasing urges to have to use the bathroom. It's not always that way. Like some people don't have that same response, but that's kind of a generalization about how the stress and anxiety you experience might impact, different parts of the gut. It's not all the same. And it's definitely dependent on kind of the, significance of the stress or the anxiety, like how severe is it? You can go from the extreme of being in war or something like that. That's obviously more of a fearful situation, to, competition anxiety, where it's still pretty profound. I mean, like performing in the Super Bowl or at the Olympics or something like that. I mean, athletes chucking up what they ate 4 hours beforehand because they're so anxious. To some, I mean, even doing a 5K, they get pretty nervous or anxious. So it's how a person perceives it and how they process the anxiety. Do they kind of think of it negatively, or are they making use of it? Is it more of a positive thing for them, kind of a signal that their body's ready to go and they harness that energy, or is it kind of more of a thing that they're struggling to deal with, and that can maybe influence their gut a little bit more negatively than if they're able to kind of think about that anxiety in more of a positive way. So there's interesting, anecdotes from history of before, the advent of ultrasound techniques and things like that, or being able to actually look inside the gut. There's a story of a Canadian fur trader who was shot in the stomach and it never healed. So he had this fistula that you could see inside his stomach. And there was a physician who treated him who ultimately kind of did a bunch of experiments on him. I mean, not an ethical thing nowadays. The guy lived as an indentured servant in this physician's home for a number of years. And that was kind of the arrangement. But he would do these little experiments and see what it would do to the activity of the stomach. He could, put things into the stomach and pull it out. Could sample the stomach juices and things like that. He would comment on how his mood would be related to his stomach activity and appearance. So, early days, even there was a basic understanding that a person's mood could impact, the function of the gut. And we've, come a long way since then. But still, there's a lot to be, kind of understood or known about it, specifically in sports. How does this work? What's the best way of dealing with it? I think is kind of where we want to go next, in terms of if an athlete does have a fair amount of competition anxiety and has GI issues as a result of that, what do we do about it? Are there strategies that actually are effective? And that's kind of where we need to go next, at least in terms of the research.
But at least then athletes know that it's not just them, that it is a phenomenon that occurs.
Yeah, I've done a few studies where we'll ask people, before a race or something like that, and then track their GI symptoms. And one was interesting in that, anxiety in general was associated with higher levels of GI issues, particularly like nausea. But especially on the morning of a race, if you felt anxious on the morning of a race, it was even more significantly associated with the occurrence of GI symptoms during the race itself. So that can be an underappreciated thing. I mean, a lot of times the gut, it's the focus is nutrition and hydration and supplements and all those sorts of things. And anxiety and stress for a segment of athletes, it's not everybody, maybe 20% of athletes, 30% of athletes, it may play a significant role in GI issues that they experience.
Yeah. So something to be mindful of anyway. Now, is there anything I haven't asked you that you think maybe listeners would like to know or need to know?
I think there's also, the topic of like supplementation is oftentimes something that comes up with GI issues, and whether or not it's a good idea to supplement with things. I mean, we talked a little bit about ginger. There's some other supplements that are, promoted as maybe being helpful for the gut, like glutamine. Okay. Bovine colostrum is another one. Right. What I would say about most of those supplements is there's some evidence that they may reduce some of the damage, or what we call kind of gut leakiness. So you can measure somebody's blood and look at the appearance of things like endotoxins and kind of evidence of kind of bacterial translocation into the blood would suggest that your gut is kind of leaky. Yeah. And exercise tends to make the gut kind of leaky, especially exercise of a prolonged duration in a hot environment. And some of those supplements seem to help reduce the gut leakiness. The question is, does that actually like manifest as something meaningful in terms of symptoms? And at this point, none of the studies have really shown that it's ultimately translated to fewer symptoms. So that's kind of my take on a lot of these supplements that are supposed to help. They'll say they like help the gut barrier or they reduce gut leakiness. That might be true, but at this point, it's hard to say whether it actually adds up to you're going to feel better. Actually, maybe not. We just don't really have good evidence for those specific outcomes.
And would they be something that you would take like during an event if you were going to be trying it?
Most of the studies on those, like two specifically, glutamine and then bovine colostrum, it's beforehand. Like you would either take it for a few days beforehand, a couple of weeks beforehand. That's the common with bovine colostrum. That's the most common way it's been done is maybe a couple of weeks. And then Glutamine, it's one where actually sometimes they'll just give it, 60 minutes or 90 minutes before.
Okay. Yeah.
And then it's kind of circulating in the blood by the time exercise starts. And the idea is that glutamine is actually used by intestinal cells as a source of energy. So part of the theory is that it's helped kind of sustain those intestinal cells that might be having a limited supply of other, fuel like glucose.
Mm. All right. So your main tip though for people is to practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think practice, but then also if you are experiencing symptoms, start to write down what are those symptoms and just get a record of, is it nausea? Is it, fullness, bloating, cramping, urges to use the restroom, to get a sense of what are the actual problems you're experiencing. Because some of the solutions that you might take to solving those problems are going to differ depending on what the predominant symptom might be. So I think maybe also just starting to get maybe a more systematic approach to documenting when you're experiencing symptoms, what was going on, what preceded it. Can you think of any things that may be contributing, whether it be anxiety, could be your nutritional choices, potentially a lack of sleep. Chronic sleep dysfunction has also been associated with GI issues. So yeah, I think just trying to get a better handle on what might be the potential causes in a record of how often you're experiencing these things. So
could our food the day before even affect us?
Yeah, in theory. I mean, especially if you're, like the FODMAP example or the fiber example would be if you had a diet that was really heavy in those substances. It takes a while for those things to transverse your entire intestinal tract. I mean, for some people, it's pretty quick. It might happen in 12 hours. For others, it might take 2 days. Interestingly, women, in total gastrointestinal transit time tends to be a little bit slower.
Okay.
So, in theory, maybe they could be more susceptible to experiencing some GI symptoms, delayed GI symptoms, if, they ate something 24 hours beforehand, as compared to men. I mean, that's speculative, but yeah, I mean, something you eat a day or two beforehand can, in some cases, ultimately cause some issues. It would probably tend to be more lower GI issues like, lower abdominal bloating or cramping or just to use the restroom. It probably wouldn't manifest as much as something like, nausea or reflux, where that's going to be more the upper half of the gut. So yeah, I mean, if you feel like you're commonly having some of those issues during events, I mean, you could trial, a low fiber, low FODMAP diet for just a couple of days before the event. You don't probably want to eat that way all the time because those actually serve as fuel for the bacteria in your gut. And, a little bit worried about going on a low FODMAP or fiber diet in terms of its health effects in the long term, but doing it for a day or two isn't going to, it shouldn't have any lasting impact on your gut health.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Now, if people want to get your book, where's the best place for them to go?
Of course, they can go to, the typical stuff on the internet like Amazon. Velopress.com also sells it. Theathletesgut.com. I do have a bookstore there that they can buy it from if they want to, support the author more directly. Any of those would be fine if they're interested in the book. Of course, you can get it from your library. Maybe I don't know how many libraries actually carry this. So I don't know if that's a viable option for most people. But
well, I don't know. I personally like for me with this book, I've written in it and those sorts of things, which is probably frowned upon with the library book. So probably best to just buy it yourself. I reckon. I think athletes will want to refer to it frequently.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that. That's fine.
Yeah. So I'll put those links on the show notes. If people want to follow you on socials, can they do that?
Yeah, I primarily use Twitter as kind of my professional social media site. So at sportsrd_PhD is my Twitter handle.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes too. Well, thank you so much for coming on today to talk with us about the athlete's gut. It's always something runners are very interested in, so we really appreciate your time.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for the invite, Isabel. It's been fun.
No worries. Thank you.